This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential. Today we're going to cover the book The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, a book about discovering and recovering your creative self. As for who recommended this book, it was recommended by both Tim Ferriss and Brian Koppelman. Brian Koppelman is a screenwriter, novelist, director, producer, known for the hit show Billions, which, despite being a hit, is one that I've never heard of. Have you heard of that one, Eric?
Yeah, I've heard of it, never seen it.
Okay, well, there you go. So I've never heard of it.
About billionaires.
Okay, well, there you go. And he is also, he's got a podcast of his own called The Moment. So if you're interested in some of this content and some of those things, he has The Moment podcast. I wouldn't recommend it over this one, but, you may want to give that a look if you're interested. And he also, in page 615 of Tools of Titans, there's a great intro to this exact book. So I'm going to turn this over to Eric, who's going to go ahead and read that page to explain why Koppelman recommended this book.
Yeah, and here's what he had to say. Every morning, what I do is based on The Morning Pages by Julia Cameron in The Artist's Way. It's 3 longhand pages where you just keep the pen moving for 3 pages, no matter what. No censoring, no rereading. It's the closest thing to magic I've come across. If you really do it every day in a real disciplined practice, something happens to your subconscious that allows you to get to your most creative place. I'd say, and I know you've had this experience with other things you've given people, and here he's talking to Tim Ferriss. I've given that book to 100 people, and I said, I'm telling you, you need to do this. Of those 100 people I've given it to, maybe 10 of them actually opened the book and did the exercises. Of those 10, 7 have had books, movies, TV shows, and made out successful. It's incredible. That book changed my life, even though it's very spiritual, and I'm an atheist.
Well, there you go. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about Julia Cameron, the author?
Yeah, Julia Cameron lives in Manhattan. She's at J_Cameron Live on Twitter.
That's Manhattan, New York City, not Manhattan, Kansas, just in case those of you out there were uncertain of that. But Manhattan in New York, yeah.
Yeah, yep, the New York one.
The Big Apple, not the Little Apple.
Yeah. So, and just a side note, I was thinking about this the other day, because right now I'm reading the Agassi book, and it's fascinating to me that, or it's just cool. It's a cool time in history, I guess, in that we can read a book and then follow the person on Twitter and see what they're talking about on a daily basis. It just struck me this week, and so Julie is another one of those. She's alive and well, and is quite active on Twitter if you're interested. She's an American teacher, author, artist, poet, playwright, novelist, filmmaker, composer, and journalist. And I just found this out today, and it kind of blew my mind. But she was married to Martin Scorsese from 1976 to 1977. So in reading this book, I just would not have thought that.
Well, she does reference her marriage to a very successful director.
And I just didn't look it up when I was reading it, but she's written quite a bit, and but the book we're discussing today, this is her best known book. So going into an overview of the book, it's sort of a workbook type of feel to it. There's large margins if you get the print copy of the book. Did you read print copy, or did you do iPad, or?
Yeah, I used my ebooks here.
Okay.
When there's an ebook that exists, I prefer it because I can get my notes and all that out of it a lot easier, and I can take it with me pretty much everywhere. I can, as you know, I'm guilty as a workaholic, as we'll talk about later, and as one of the things she singles here in terms of having multiple jobs and being on the clock pretty much all the time. So it's good to have it be able to read this sort of thing on my phone while I'm in line or something. So
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of margins in the books to where she encourages you to write things out. She'll ask questions, so it's kind of like you read through a chapter, get some ideas, and then can go through some questions that she has at the end of each chapter. So I actually read through the book rather quickly. Julia Cameron suggests taking 12 weeks to go through it. I did some of the exercises, just even going through the book. I mean, I would try to make notes, but if there was like, if she said like list 10 things about such and such, I might do like 5 of them. So I kind of breezed through it. I know if I did take it slower, I'd get more out of it, but it's basically a book about recovery. And if you're a creative or you want to be a creative type and you feel that you've lost your art, you've lost your creativity, no matter what the reason is, the book contains tasks, habits, mindsets, different things to free yourself from that blocked state or state of being asleep as an artist. And two main ways that she suggests doing that is through things that we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's morning pages and the artist state. So basically taking time each morning to write, just kind of free-flowing writing, and then taking at least 2 hours a week to set a date on the calendar where it's you time
with
to
your
be an
inner
artist.
child.
Yeah. So wanted to just kind of give an overview of what the book is like. And it, in a lot of ways, it's similar to a previous book we read, Bird by Bird, kind of regaining that art or getting unblocked, I guess you could say. What were your initial reactions to the book?
As is my way, mixed, a little bit mixed. I mean, I think overall, I think this is, I would say much more positive. I had much more of a positive reaction to it than a negative reaction. I can nitpick all sorts of things. It's just, part of my way. But I thought overall, I mean, reading through this as a creative, as someone who's constantly working in that arena, I thought that the vast majority of what she had to say in here, if people follow what's in this book, it'll work. She's right about very, very nearly everything she says in terms of how to make sure that you get unblocked and unstuck, and some of the ways of thinking about productivity and creativity and all that. And I think generally speaking, most of the book in terms of suggestions and all that, this, if somebody does want to unblock and become, either discover creativity that they weren't aware that they had, or basically finally get to the projects that they've wanted to do forever and all that, this I think is a very helpful tool. It's probably very useful for those who actually are blocked, and a lot of what it says in terms of suggestions, there are things that I over my life have sort of come to. So there was a lot in this where it was like, oh yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think the practices that she's suggesting are good ideas as well. So that said, there are some, we'll get into some of my complaints about where she goes with this. I think one of my biggest complaints is that there's a little bit of a power of positive thinking, quasi Joel Osteen kind of, affirmation. You speak you speak what you want into existence sort of approach to some of this, that in some ways I actually think there's some truth to much of that, in terms of you have not because you ask not kind of thing. Like, you don't get what you don't ask for. You don't find what you don't seek. At the same point, there's some complaints that I have about that approach in terms of where it can go once it's stretched to a certain point. But we'll get to that, I think, a little bit later in the podcast. It's probably not good to go with that in the overview. So I have a few little complaints about some of those things. But overall, I mean, I thought this was... both of us read it pretty quickly because we're doing this project and not using it as a tool. But my impression was that this as a tool would be a very very useful and very productive tool for most artists, particularly those who are trying to get back into some sense of productivity.
Yeah. I had generally a good view of the book, and like you said, kind of hit on things that I'd come across in my life just through experience, and so look forward to talking through it. So we'll get into our favorite quotes here. My first one is in regards to faith, where she says, "Creativity requires faith. Faith requires that we relinquish control." And that's one thing about this book, and Koppelman hits on it, where he said even though the book was spiritual and I'm an atheist, it was interesting to him, and I liked that part of it. Julia Cameron comes from a Catholic background, so there's a lot of faith, God, Christian God type stuff. That
loosely Christian God.
Loosely,
I mean, she's very influenced by a lot of a lot of Eastern writing, Meister Eckhart, all sorts of different things mixed in with what is very clearly some Christian foundation there. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think a book about creativity has to have that to some degree, because we're not talking about concrete things in a lot of ways. Especially how it's, I'm going to go into my second quote here because it goes into what I'm trying to get across here. The second quote: "I learned to get out of the way and let that creative force work through me." And then another one: "Art is not about thinking something up. It's about the opposite, getting something down. The directions are important here." And I connected with that with creativity when I've had it come through the most in my life. It's never been like from down up, like from down within me up out of me. It's more something that comes from outside of me through me, and then it happens, and it's something it's hard to explain. And I think she did a good job of trying to explain that, and that's where I think that faith aspect has to come in on a book like this, because you're talking about things that when you realize that they really do happen, or some creative music thing you do, or writing, and you're like, where in the world did that come from? That, like, I know I did not do that. There's got to be something that's working outside of that. So I connected with that, and yeah, I just think that it's got to be it's got to be in the conversation about creativity. And I think she's kind of all over the place, but I liked how she did talk about it.
Yeah, I actually appreciated a lot of where she went with that, and actually in Christian theology, this is often very much neglected in more modern Christian interpretations, where in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, you get this theme of being a partner with God in the process of creation. So, obvious example of this is in Genesis 1, where humanity at the very beginning is endowed with the image of God, and is told to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth and to have dominion, and all that. These are godlike roles that involve the process of creation. I mean, being fruitful and multiplying is actually creation in that sense as well. And then you get the same thing in the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3, where he says, "We then are God's co-workers." That concept has in Christian theology has been brought out more clearly as humanity is specifically called as the image of God to be co-creators with God, to bring about good in the world as a part of the natural order that God has created humanity for. So, and similarly, you have this idea of the church is the body of Christ, and so what God does is done through the people on earth who serve as the hands and feet and so on of Jesus Christ, who's working through his people. So, the idea of the following the gospel is to become an agent of justice in the world is how I often will summarize that when teaching this, those concepts. So that's that idea. And she definitely does in other ways, in more roundabout ways, get to some of those things, but does so in a way that is friendly to those who are not from a Christian or Jewish or monotheistic perspective. I mean, it's very much available to anyone. She just says, listen, in order to be a creative person, you have to recognize that creativity doesn't just come from your conscious mind, that you have to kind of tap into this collective creator that works through you. And if you're not willing to recognize how that works, then you're probably not going to be very creative. So, that's one of the foundations that she starts with. And I think she's pretty much right.
Yeah, and it's an important concept for me. I mean, I named my company EPR Creations for that reason, just that co-creator aspect of creativity. And so I've been thinking about this kind of stuff for a long time, and so it was cool in this book and in Bird by Bird to see it fleshed out a little bit. So
yep. So my first favorite, I'll put it a different way. That way I'm not saying it as though it's my first favorite, my most favorite. First favorite quote, the first one on the list, is a short one. But boy, is it true. Nothing dies harder than a bad idea. Yeah. I'm just going to let that one sit. Nothing dies harder than a bad idea. Man, you can double tap an idea, going to the zombie thing. You double tap, don't get stingy with your bullets. No, those bad ideas, they come back worse than zombies. She is right. Nothing dies harder than a bad idea. I'm just going to sit with that one.
I like the zombie reference to that. So do you want to do another one, or should I hit?
I guess I'll do another one. As artists, we can literally reap what we sow, SEW. And this is part of a larger section where she's talking about how learning to make the space for your creative juices to begin to flow and learning to fill the well, as she talks about. You can't create from an empty well. You have to have water to pour out or to draw from the well. She says, any regular repetitive action primes the well. Writers have heard many woeful tales of the Bronte sisters and poor Jane Austen, forced to hide their stories under their needlework. A little experiment with some mending can cast a whole new light on these activities. Needlework, by definition regular and repetitive, both soothes and stimulates the artist within. Whole plots can be stitched up while we sew. As artists, we can very literally reap what we sow. And I've found that to be very true, actually. When sometimes if I am blocked, if I'm struggling to get ideas out or to put things together, one of the things that I'll do, and she talks about this, is I'll go cook, I'll find something repetitive to do, whether working out of certain types, ride a bike, do different things to just get yourself into this repetitive point where you're not consciously concentrating on what you have to do, and you can let your mind just sort of wander. It's extraordinarily stimulating, and that's the sort of thing that actually we need to be able to do to be able to be productive creatives. And again, I think she puts it really well and explains how you have to take that time. It's not always procrastination. It's actually time where you're letting your brain relax enough to actually refill so that it can do its work, sort of unconsciously, subconsciously.
Yeah. Even now, every time I run, I go out with my headphones on and I'm listening to podcasts the whole time. But I'm like, sometimes I should just take at least one run a week where I don't listen to anything and just kind of let the mind go,
Yeah, I've found that, and I'm so constantly listening to podcasts as well. I also have taken to making some space there a little bit more frequently, where when I'm in the car, just driving with nothing on, no music, no podcasts, walking around a little bit with no music, no podcasts, just making some space, because I've got to let the brain relax a little bit in order to keep myself from creative drought. And that's something that she, I think, does a good job of talking to. And we have to be careful that we don't overstimulate, that we don't wind up in, I say this on a podcast where we're reading 52 books and talking about 52 books in a year. But she talks about, you can read too much of other people's stuff. You can constantly have so much going on, and you're intaking so much that you actually don't have the space to digest and to relax and to refill. And that part is important if we're going to be productive creatives. So I think she gets that right.
Yeah. And kind of case in point with this book where I just flew through it. And I know you did as well. And it was one of those where, yeah, if you did spend a little more time with it, it'd be a lot more powerful, I think, but maybe for another time. So speaking of along those lines, my next one, for a workaholic, work is synonymous with worth. And so we are hesitant to jettison any part of it. And this one just stung me because that's me. I mean, if like I remember in my first job, if somebody would come by and talk to me at my illustrious cubicle, I would get mad. I would just kind of try to give them every single sign I possibly could that I'm working. I don't talk when I work. I'm working. And so I'm really bad with that. And especially since I work from home and there's kids at the house and just stuff that needs to get done. I have a really bad tendency of work is synonymous with worth. And so if I need to do something other than work, my worth goes down, and it's a really bad way to obviously look at it. So
yeah, well,
that one stung a little bit.
Yeah, there are a couple that stung like that for me as well. That one hit a little close to home for me as well, because I also talk to my wife about this, and she'll tell you that that she is hesitant to interrupt in some cases, because you don't want to. She doesn't want. There's the section in here that's also related to this, or at least I related it to it. That when the creative is interrupted, you get the snap, which you were just talking about. Like you're trying to communicate, like no, like stop. And there are times where she'll go to say something, and I'll just turn, and it's my expression of displeasure at being interrupted while I'm in the flow, that she's just like, never mind, and it makes her hesitant to interrupt me, which is not always a good thing, because you need to communicate with your spouse, and there's important thing other really important things here, but yeah, that one definitely definitely hit very close to home. Okay, so next one for me. I really liked this one. It is impossible to get better and look good at the same time. Now, granted, I understand I am an exception to this, but for everyone else, for all the listeners and all that, this is something that I'm constantly trying to reinforce to students and to anybody, that learning requires failure.
Yeah.
Learning means you're making a fool of yourself. It's only once you have learned that you're no longer making a fool of yourself by trying to learn. So it's impossible to get better and look good at the same time. And then she continues to say, by being willing to be a bad artist, you have a chance to be an artist, and perhaps over time a very good one. But if you're not willing to be a bad artist, then you have no chance of being an artist at all. So yeah, I liked that a lot.
Yeah, that's good. My last one here, she's talking about a friend of hers. Jenny runs for her soul, not her body.
Yeah, that's madness.
That's awesome.
I thought you had another one up there. There's one more that you haven't read.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
you hit one, and then I'll close out with that one.
Yeah. So this one is one that I very much relate to. Anger is a tool, not a master. Anger is meant to be tapped into and drawn upon. Used properly, anger is useful. So then she further, plays this out about anger, and she says, sloth, apathy, and despair are the enemy. Anger is not. Anger is our friend, not a nice friend, not a gentle friend, but a very, very loyal friend. I loved that section because when people have asked me, like, what, it's periodically this will, people who have read my work or, in interviews or whatever, people will ask, what really drives your work? What inspires you to write? And my answer, I've taken to giving a one-word answer, which is rage.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning this in Bird by Bird, and that's one thing that Anne Lamott in Bird by Bird suggests if people are stuck. She just says,
"Find what makes you angry."
Something that makes you angry.
Yeah, and that works for me.
Right.
Yeah, it works for me. No questions asked. Anger stimulates the creative juices because somebody's wrong on the internet or wherever else, and it needs to be fixed. So now I have the stimulation to actually do the creative project, whatever it is that I'm doing.
All right, well, I'll hit my last one, and it's my experience that we're much more afraid that there might be a God than we are that there might not be.
Yeah, that actually is on my list as well, and it continues with, incidents like those above happen to us, and yet we dismiss them as sheer coincidence. People talk about how dreadful it would be if there were no God. I think such talk is hooey. Most of us are a lot more comfortable feeling we're not being watched too closely. And this betrays, actually, she's probably borrowing a little bit of this. If not, it's exactly the same sentiment as what was said by C.S. Lewis 30 or 40 years before this was written, where Lewis talked about his conversion to Christianity. And he actually takes on the Freudian idea of wish fulfillment. And he says, listen, if I had my own, Freud's idea of, God as wish fulfillment, that we all wish for, a great parent in the sky. He's like, there's nothing I dislike more than being interrupted. And the idea of a God who has the right to interrupt and inconvenience me at any point, and that I have to actually live according to someone else. And that someone else is watching me all the time, that makes me extraordinarily uncomfortable. If I had my wish, I'd wish that wasn't the case. Well, and she says exactly the same.
Yeah, and Lewis says he was the most reluctant convert in all of England. So
right, because again, he would have preferred I can do what I want and not be interrupted. Whereas if there is a God, there might be requirements that God imposes upon you that you deal with. And she, the last couple quotes that I had actually relate specifically to that one, so they'll build right off of it. She says, "Ask and you shall receive, knock and it shall be opened to you." These words are among the more unpleasant ones ascribed to Jesus Christ. And I've said that for years, and she just puts it so well there that it's dead on. Like, wait, that's frightening. Like, if I actually might get what I ask for, like, what if I ask for bad stuff? What if I ask for things that aren't good for me? Like, that's terrifying, right? And then she says, answered prayers are scary. They imply responsibility. You asked for it. Now that you've got it, what are you going to do? Yeah, that's kind of the problem. So yeah, that's a frightening saying, right there that, again, gets back to this idea that it's kind of scary, this idea that you might actually get what you asked for, that there might be a God, that there might be some marching orders that, you're created to do. And, as soon as you realize that, like, wait, what, that's scary. And then she further goes along and says, oh, and by the way, take your life in your own hands. And what happens? She's saying, take action. Actually, this gets back to the faith thing that she talks about that was in your first quote, that faith requires that we relinquish control. Creativity requires faith. She says, you have to step out and actually, start writing, start doing the thing that you want to do creatively. She says, take your life in your own hands. And what happens? A terrible thing. No one to blame. And there's a lot of these sort of little pithy things in this book that I really liked. Some of the little aphorism type quotes in this that a lot of them are along these lines. I really liked a lot of those.
Yeah. When she quotes from different people throughout, and it's in the margins of the book, and it's really nice too. A lot of good quotes there. But yeah, and the ask and you shall receive. I remember when I was a kid, I remember laying awake at night, and I would do this multiple nights in a row, where I was praying that God would turn me into a frog so that I would know that He was real. And I'm really glad that one wasn't answered.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. I mean, there's also, the man who prays to, marry the beautiful pageant contestant, and, woe unto that man sometimes who receives what he wishes for, right?
Yeah.
Oh, anyway, that comes from a conversation from some friends of mine who were talking about a good friend of theirs who did marry a pageant winner, and life can be difficult when you get what you want. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into a little bit more of the details of this book and interact with some of the concepts a little bit more. First things first, we should talk a little bit more about the morning pages and artist dates. This is what she has to say about morning pages at the beginning. She says, "The morning pages acquaint us with what we think and what we think we need. We identify problem areas and concerns. We complain, enumerate, identify, isolate, fret. This is step 1, analogous to prayer. In the course of the release engendered by our artist date, step 2, we begin to hear solutions. Perhaps equally important, we begin to fund the creative reserves we will draw on in fulfilling our artistry." So that's the basic framework that this whole book depends upon, is this idea of being willing to free associate and write stream of consciousness freely every morning to sort of get that stuff out of your system and confess it before God. It is absolutely sort of, and it's what evangelicals might often call prayer writing. This is what she builds her whole system on, is do that in the morning, and then once a week at least do this artist date where you open yourself to the opportunity to, free up your inner child, your artist, to get some sense of what needs to happen. So, to fill the well, that sort of thing. So that's the structure of it. Have you tried any of this, Eric?
Yeah, I read this book in June, and I've been doing the morning pages since then. I was regular on it for a while, and then recently with child and moving and stuff, I've maybe just done it like once or twice a week. But yeah, I'd say for a few months there, I was doing it probably 5, 6, 7 times a week in the mornings. And yeah, I mean, nothing like earth shattering, but I guess what it did help was to just get the ideas out of my head and onto paper. And so I think there's a lot of benefit in that, of just, and I would try to do what she said, of just, not having a plan for what you're going to write, but just letting stuff come out. But I used to journal a lot, so what mine ended up being were just more like journal entries instead of, it was kind of stream of conscious / journal entry, instead of, I think what she's going more is just for a stream of conscious.
Well, I think I don't think the way she puts it, I don't think that there is a right or wrong way to do it, except to overthink it. So
Yeah.
if what you're doing is stream of conscious journal entries, that seemed to me to be what she was actually getting at in certain spots, where it was like, if that's what comes out, that's what you do.
Yeah.
So, I think that is more or less what she's going after.
Well, and for me, I mean, I live a lot of my life in my head, and so I think that it did help me in that sense of, it's almost like after I would write something out, it's like, okay, I've dealt with that. It doesn't need to be in my head anymore. I've put that somewhere else. Yeah, kind of that idea of transferring. I read Getting Things Done, that book with that title, Getting Things Done. And that was one of the things that he suggests is, if you have an idea in your head of a task you need to do, don't keep it in your head, like write it down immediately. And whether that's, you do that in Evernote or some task manager thing, the idea is the more you have that in your head, the more space it takes up for more important thinking that you need to do. So whenever something comes up, like the author of that book said he would have a notebook by his bed. So even if he woke up in the middle of the night, he would write it down. So I kind of think about, or think, I thought about the morning pages kind of in that light of like, is stuff going on in my head, it allowed it to get out to where it didn't take up that space anymore. And so that aspect of it was very helpful for me. I think once things kind of calm down again in my life, I will try to get back into it, doing it each morning.
Yeah, it strikes me as it's. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, but more for that aspect of getting things out and kind of seeing them on where I type it to see it there and not have it keep circulating in my brain.
Yeah, it strikes me as a very helpful practice. I mean, I have not adopted this, as I just recently read this book more. I read this much more recently than you did. But it strikes me as a very helpful practice. As you know, it's one of those options. I don't know that you necessarily have to use that particular form, but I think some form of meditation, prayer that serves basically the analogous purpose is necessary.
Yeah. And I mean, do you journal at all or anything like that?
Never really have. No.
Yeah.
I think I've tried like 2 or 3 times, and just it goes by the wayside within a few days. It's just not something I've ever, as disciplined as I am in lots of ways. That's one area where I've just never had the discipline.
In high school, I did all the time. I mean, I probably every day in high school I would. So I have in the past, but just not as much recently. And then as far as the artist dates go, I haven't done anything like that. As suggested in this book, but I could definitely see that being a benefit, and maybe after we move, might be sad. It's just tough with our current
with your current situation with a newborn
and
and everything else. Some of those things are a little less practical at the moment, even though the book wants you to very much claim that time regardless. Practically speaking, that life does intervene in some of those things. And again, I think the key is being available, is making yourself available to have space to think and to be loose. To me, the artist date thing is more about freeing up your ability to be, I don't want to say juvenile, but childlike. More that than anything, to make space to not be so serious and focused on, adult problems all the time, to make space for that. And so, when I was reading through the artist date thing, I was like, for me, this is probably not going to be all that useful because I already live. I'm already basically a child anyway. So, a lot of what this book was suggesting as, in order to, free yourself up and unblock as a creative, you have to do this. And I was like, well, I live like that. So, and that's probably why I'm not all that blocked. So,
but that is a key part of this book, where she talks a lot about play. And we saw that a lot in Natural Born Heroes, where instead of this strict idea of going to the gym every day and doing set workouts, more of the idea of going to a jungle gym or an adult playpen type thing. And
which I was at today, actually.
Yeah. And I like that, it's not more the idea of free play as opposed to structured living. So that's something that really stuck out to me in this book. And I think it's a good suggestion. And as you say, you equate the artist date with that of playing, and yeah, there could definitely be more of that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I mean, you know me as well enough to know that I certainly don't take myself too seriously with these sorts of things. And when it comes to, there were a lot of the places in this book where it's like, think of something crazy that you would never do, and I just read it and I was like, well, nothing's coming to mind. Think about something. Stop fearing that your family and friends would think you crazy, right? Okay. What would you do that just that you would never imagine yourself doing. You know, think of something that you wish you could do, but you would never imagine that you would actually do. And it was like, nothing's coming to mind.
Yeah, but for me, I was like, I was writing stuff down a lot in those things because.
Yeah, you live a little tighter to the vest than I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was reading through this, and I've got a lot of little marginal comments like, not feeling anything. You know, it's got like this. There's a whole section on shame. Like if it were so easy to take an action, you know, and all this stuff about shame, like that. You know, what will the neighbors think? I live. I live without shame, so I mean, completely without shame. So a lot of the lists and questions that she had didn't really apply all that well to me because, well, you know, I guess I'm not all that blocked with that stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Trying to find a couple of these. Let's see. You know, another one that was funny, you know, the enemy within, the core negative beliefs. This is probably a good place to talk about that, right? How did you respond? So this is that section on the censor, right? So you have core negative beliefs, right? You've got these, you know, if I go to become an artist, then, you know, people will hate me. I will go crazy. I can't spell. I don't have enough good ideas or whatever. And then it says your ally within. You've got that section where it has... as block creatives, we often sit on the sidelines critiquing those in the game. He's not so talented, we may say, of a currently hot artist, and we may be right about that. But then it basically says, okay, here it says, as block creatives, we tend to regard these bogus spotlight grabbers with animosity. We may be able to defer to true genius, but if it's merely a genius for self-promotion we're witnessing, our resentment runs high. Now, that is true. I think you've probably experienced that as much as I have. This is not just jealousy. It is a stalling technique that reinforces our staying stuck. We make speeches to ourselves and other willing victims. I could do that better if only. You could do it better if only you would let yourself do it. Affirmations will help you allow yourself do it. An affirmation is a positive statement of positive belief. If we can become 1/10 as good at positive self-talk as we are at negative self-talk, we will notice an enormous change. So then she says, okay, we can easily and without embarrassment bludgeon ourselves with negative affirmations. I'm not gifted enough, not clever enough, not original enough, not young enough, etc. But saying nice things about ourselves is notoriously hard to do. It feels pretty awful at first. Try these and see if they don't sound hopelessly syrupy. I deserve love. I deserve fair play because I'm good enough. I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me, right? No, that's not in there, but I deserve a rewarding creative life. I am a brilliant and successful artist. I have rich creative talents. I am competent and confident in my creative work. And then she says, did your censor perk its nasty little ears up? Censors loathe anything that sounds like self-worth. They immediately start up with the imposter routine. What do you think who do you think you are? So what was your response to reading this passage?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Anytime anyone says anything good or I think something good, I'm right away back with yeah. And even in that section, I'm in that section right now, and I wrote all the, like, when she was talking about those types of things, I wrote out all the, she calls them blurts.
Yeah.
The objections that will start to pop up like burnt toast, and so I just wrote the bursts.
Yeah, it says the censor objects, hey, wait a minute. You can't say all that positive stuff around me, right? That's when the objections. Yeah. And so those are your blurts.
Yeah.
So you wrote a bunch
wrote
of
those down. Yeah. And I mean, even with music, like, I mean, I played music since I was 3 years old. I've taken violin lessons since I was 3. But even with that,
you're an awesome violinist. You know?
Well, but I still hear those things even with that. So it's like, yeah. It really doesn't matter what I do. It's like website development. Well, you're not really a designer. You didn't do design. Running. Well, you're not really, you know, all these guys are better than you at running, and it doesn't really matter what it is. It's like I hear that stuff constantly in my head. Yeah,
Carrie,
but you don't.
My wife.
You don't, or
no, my wife was saying you really shouldn't put this in the podcast. It's not the sort of thing you want to admit publicly. But my marginal note for the these are your blurts is not the case for me. My censor is dead or asleep. My first response is, "Yep, this is true." When it says, try picking an affirmation. For example, I, blank, your name, am a brilliant and prolific, and then, potter, painter, poet, whatever you are, so writer or whatever. Write that 10 times in a row. While you're busy doing that, something interesting will happen. And then it says the censor will come in and say no. When I do that, it's like, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I wish I had that.
I've worked really hard at this, and, I think I'm pretty good at it.
Yeah.
So, like, okay. And I don't have, there's not any, that experience of the censor is so removed, because generally speaking, it's like, well, because I don't know, years ago, I had this realization that everybody else is always obsessed with themselves and their own concerns. And I realized that nobody else is really nobody else tends to be watching you.
Yeah.
Right. We all have this sense initially that oh no, when I make a mistake, everybody's going to be paying attention to me and watching me. And, they'll think bad of me.
They're all too concerned about themselves.
Yeah, they're all wrapped up in themselves thinking the same thing. It occurred to me when I was young that was the case. I don't know, maybe my dad was, told me that, or my mom. But, I took it to heart, and I realized everybody else is obsessed with whether they're, going to get it right or not. So I don't have to worry about it. All right, well, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And I hear all these people talking about, and this is true in the in the academic world all the time. I hear, my colleagues talk all about, their imposter syndrome, sense of imposter syndrome. I don't have it. It's like, you'll never overcome imposter syndrome. Why not? All you have to do is recognize that everybody else is faking it. And then at that point, it's, well, okay, even if I were faking it, I'm doing a pretty good job, so I'm no more of a faker than anybody else. And as it stands, the stuff that I'm doing, I'm working really hard at, and I ain't faking. So, okay.
Yeah, I wish. That'd be awesome.
Now, I did have another note on this as well, where it talks about censors loathe anything that sounds like real self-worth. They immediately start up with the imposter routine. Who do you think you are? And I think that there is something to how Western culture has been founded on. This actually, I think, goes back to certain Christian theologizing over the centuries, where there's been a constant concern in the West, in particular, about pride or arrogance, and in particular, this idea about working for your own salvation in sort of the Protestant West. Right? You never want to be someone who believes that you actually do something of value or worth, because as soon as you say that, now you're basically that's the only way you can be irredeemable. What you really need to admit is that you're totally depraved, and that, only God is good, and that there's nothing good in me. Like, for me to say I've done anything good, I don't want to do. And there's a theological basis for that, particularly in certain Reformed or Protestant communities. And so what you're told, growing up in that world, or once you're in that world, is if you think that you're good or good at anything, then that's a very dangerous thing. And it's also everyone else's job to remind you that that's not true. Right?
Yeah, my pastor in college said, "Eric, you're a piece of in SHIT."
Yeah. Yeah.
That was
Yeah. So this is where you get that doctrine that there's, of total depravity, that human beings, there's nothing good in any of us. And actually, this, interestingly, in my view, is not compatible with the notion of human dignity as image bearers that you find in earliest Christianity and in Judaism. So, and actually, there was another podcast, probably about a week or so before we recorded this. We'll put the show in the show notes. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But there's a podcast in which a theologian from the UK talks about how the doctrine of total depravity, as put forward in the Reformation, is very much a departure from early Christian notions about human nature and about humanity in general. And it's certainly a big departure. I mean, I spend a lot of time working in early Judaism. It's certainly a big departure from the view in Judaism. And I actually think that the tendency of Jews not to come from this angle, that all human beings are made totally depraved and that there's nothing good in human beings, the tendency of Jews not to come from this angle is actually, I think, a part of why so many Jews have been successful creatives, like disproportionately in the West. You look at Hollywood, look at a lot of authors, look at a lot of successful, a lot of the successful sectors of society, and you find, particularly in the creative sectors, and you find Jews everywhere disproportionately. And I think that's one reason. I think also there's, statistically, Jews tend to be more highly educated, more urban, and so there's some other factors here. But I think that factor is one of the reasons that that this is a theological factor. And now, even though in the modern West it's largely post-Christian, that Christian foundation of, well, we're all sinners, we all have our, we're all screw-ups, there's nothing good in us, that part still has kind of stuck with the culture. And I think that's really the source of a lot of this negative censor that we have to get past. And I think one of the reasons that I don't have the same level of censor or same filter on that is because I grew up without that theological baggage. Mm-hmm. And that's something I'll credit my parents with. I didn't grow up with that, that angle of, you better not think you're good at anything, or, if you think you're good, or if you think you're, anything you do is going to please God, then, you got another thing coming. That's not that idea. The idea of resisting any idea that, what you do matters in the eyes of God, or that it could be good in the eyes of God is I think that's a big foundation for that. I found that interesting as food for thought as I was reading through this.
Well, and kind of ties in with a note I had here of the love your neighbor as yourself, and the flip of that is that you must love yourself to love others as yourself. And I think it kind of ties in with this. If you're constantly just berating yourself as totally depraved and all that, then how is that going to impact the love of your neighbor?
Yeah, if you treat yourself like a piece of feces, if you believe that you're nothing more than a piece of feces, and you treat yourself that way and you think of yourself that way, then it's not going to be too long before you're going to think of other people that way too, if you're going to love them like yourself, because you don't love yourself. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard lesson to learn, but I think that's something she gets to here, is that in order to be a productive and successful creative, you actually have to love yourself, and you have to accept that God loves you. The Creator created you to love and be lovely, to use Adam Smith's language from the Theory of Moral Sentiments, but to love and be lovely, and that the first step is actually to admit that and to be willing to love oneself. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, to love oneself, you have to get rid of the things that aren't lovely. Yeah. Right? Because, there are things that, we say, I don't like that part of myself. Well, then that means I need to be consistent. I need to eliminate that. And she talks about some of that in this book as well.
Yeah. I wanted to hit on a corridor principle, which my entrepreneurship professors talked about. And my entrepreneurship professors were very, they were both actual entrepreneurs. We didn't get a textbook on entrepreneurship and then read that. It was like you were hearing from their lives, and we had to create companies, and just kind of a different approach than I think it's taught in most programs now. But the corridor principle is basically, if you start down a path, doors will open up within that path, within that corridor, that you just never would have anticipated. And she hits on this a few points in the book. There's even a Joseph Campbell quote that she hits, where it's follow your bliss and doors will open where there were no doors before. And then another section, in outsized lives, such moments stand out, large as Mount Rushmore. Lewis and Clark headed west. Isaac Dinesen took off for Africa. We all have our Africas, those dark and romantic notions that call to our deepest selves. Uh-huh. When we answer that call, when we commit to it, we set in motion the principle that Jung dubbed synchronicity, loosely defined as a fortuitous intermeshing of events. Back in the 60s, we called it serendipity. Whatever you choose to call it, once you begin your creative recovery, you may be startled to find it cropping up everywhere. So I always remember that corridor principle, because they said that was the only principle they took from the business books or whatever. whereas everything else was more from their experience. But I find that to be the case just even with the work I do there, or starting a company. Just it opens up things that you never thought or never planned. And one of the purposes of this book is to get you back. I mean, the subtitle is a spiritual path to higher creativity. So it's getting you to start walking in that direction where these types of things will begin happening. But it's not something that you can necessarily say, well, I'm going to start going this so that this happens and this happens and this happens. No, it's just kind of things start happening you just never thought were possible or could have foreseen happening.
Yeah, Reid Hoffman on the I don't know if you're listening to the Masters of Scale podcast.
Yeah, it's excellent.
The one from this week was on how the most scalable ideas are the ones that come at you sideways.
Yeah.
You may be going down the corridor, but all of a sudden you get hit by something else, and that ends up being the thing that really takes. That's the thing that makes it, and it may not be the thing that you expected. And she's got a great quote on that in this book, actually, where she says, it seems as though the way the universe works is that you shake an apple tree and the universe gives you oranges. The universe sends you oranges. She says, shaking trees, going out and shaking the trees is important, but understand that the trees you shake may not be the things that you actually get. You're going to get, the universe is funny that way, that something may come at you sideways, but the main thing is you got to get in the corridor.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I liked that as well.
Well, there was one suggestion that I didn't like.
I knew you wouldn't like it.
Deprive yourself of reading, and
you haven't tried
hit
that
on
yet,
that a little bit earlier. Well, I mean, not this year, obviously, because I'm trying to get through 52 books, and I'm on 42 right now, so it's looking kind of dicey if I'm going to make it to do 10 more here in the rest of the year. But
I'm getting to where I'm probably not going to quite make my goal either, but we're getting close.
Yeah. Well, and the cool thing is that even at 42, that's the most books I've ever read in 1 year. So even if I don't hit 52, it was I've enjoyed it. But but just that idea, kind of what we were talking about before, where building some space into your life of for me, that might mean running and not having headphones on, or I mean, and anytime I'm walking or doing chores around the house, I've always got a podcast going. And maybe I can every once in a while not do that and just kind of let the ideas go.
Well, I mean, there is a certain point at which, like, how much more can you learn from the next podcast episode? I mean, you've heard almost everything before. Now it's time to sometimes to get out of the way. So you have to strike that balance and figure out where you're at in the corridor.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else that stuck out to you?
Well, I liked one of the quotes about the reading deprivation where she's explaining it. She says, "For most block creatives, reading is an addiction. We gobble the words of others rather than digest our own thoughts and feelings, rather than cook up something of our own." First of all, because it's a lot easier, and secondly, because there's no risk to it. I liked that idea that, sometimes in order to really get to where you can create, you have to stop gobbling up the junk food of what other people are saying, step away from the stream, as we've talked about previously on prior episodes, and start to let something simmer in your own head and figure out if there's anything of value that you've got to contribute at that moment. So I like that. I like that image.
Yeah, that was good. Again, we come across a lot of ideas of the small things.
Oh yeah.
The changing small habits and how that can impact, and she had some quotes for that. You didn't realize how many small things you could do to improve your own life. And then she quotes Tolstoy by saying, "True life is lived when tiny changes occur." And another one in talking about space flight, by altering the launch trajectory very slightly, a great difference can be made over time. And
my golf game is an example of that. You've seen that firsthand.
it's something that has come up a lot in a lot of the books, and I'm sure I realized it earlier in my life, but for some reason I think of this year 2017 as being the year where this really hit home for me. And whether it's exercise, reading, relationship stuff, marriage stuff, like it's the small things that can really change the trajectory. And I guess part of it is I kind of always had this idea that there'd be these big bang things in life that happen, and that's where the trajectory changes in your life. Like some big thing happens, and then that's the thing. But what I'm really realizing this year is it's the small things, and doing them on a consistent basis, and in a the daily habits, and how that's really the things that make a difference. And she hits on that a lot in this book.
No single snowflake thinks it's responsible for the avalanche.
We're all special snowflakes.
Right. Well, but again, I mean, that's the thing is that, in order to get the big things, you have to, the big things are created by collecting just enough little things to actually, until finally you reach that tipping point. Mm-hmm. And it's only by getting those little things that you can put yourself in position for the big things. So and she talks a lot about that. And I thought that was very useful. I also liked how she talked about the process of inspiration and how creative inspiration actually works. And again, one of the quotes that I'd highlighted on this goes back to these little things, the small things, where she says, art may seem to involve broad strokes, grand schemes, great plans, but it's the attention to detail that stays with us. The singular image is what haunts us and becomes art. Even in the midst of pain, this singular image brings delight. And I can think of numerous examples of great artists in the past, and movies and all sorts of things that were built out from one image that the author just couldn't get rid of. C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia started with this image in his head of a lion that he just couldn't shake for years and years and years, and finally he wrote, and it all came out of that image. And actually, the first image of that with the fawn and all that stuff, all that's coming out of the imagery that he'd had in his head, and he just started writing from the imagery, and ultimately ended up with a classic children's series as a result of just following a few images that had stuck with him for like a decade. And that's one example. Or Good Will Hunting. Good Will Hunting grew out of one scene, like in the middle of the movie. Right? The scene, I'm pretty sure if I remember right, it was the scene where Will and Minnie Driver, I don't remember the name of the character right now, but where Will and Minnie Driver are having a talk over the table in outside the bookstore and all that, and he's just going back and forth with her. The whole movie grew out of that. He had an image of this particular thing that he wanted to play with for a class, and then the project just started growing, and he started, like, the character grew, and then he got a story out of it. And it's a brilliant movie. It's the little image, that little thing, and then the commitment to just sort of, well, okay, let's plant that seed and let's see where it goes, that ends up producing great art. I really liked that concept of inspiration and the way that she explained it and expressed it and how to get to it, I thought was one of the more useful pieces of the book. And it occurs in multiple chapters.
That's really cool.
I did also like her again, the emphasis I read above about, doing repetitive activities and so on. I highlighted this one because it's just so true for me, where it says, "Why do I get my best ideas in the shower?" an exasperated Einstein is said to have remarked. And is that true for you?
For me, what's funny is I always say I solve more problems on the way and in the bathroom, on the way to and in the bathroom than in front of my computer.
So you're a Van Halen.
Yeah. So when I had office space, I would just sit in front of the screen trying to solve something, and I would just sit there and it wouldn't work. And I was like, I'd finally get to the point where I was like, I just have to go to the bathroom. I'd stand up, open the door, get in the hall, and I would solve it. It was amazing. It was just even that shift of just getting up out of being in front of the computer screen, I could solve. And then a lot for me is running too.
Yeah.
And so it's really important time for me where I just kind of, even if I have the podcast going, I'll just kind of zone out for a little bit, and then
you have to go track back on the podcast to catch up where you were, because you start thinking, yeah, I do the same thing.
Yeah.
But she continues and she says, brain research now tells us that this is because showering is an artist brain activity. I don't know exactly how research could show that, but okay. Showering, swimming,
especially if
scrubbing.
it's electric currents going, measuring the brain in the shower.
Yeah, it could be complicated. Showering, swimming, scrubbing, shaving, steering a car, so many S-like yes words. All of these are regular, repetitive activities that may tip us over from our logic brain into our more creative artist brain. Solutions to sticky creative problems may bubble up through the dishwasher, emerge on the freeway, just as we're executing a tricky merge. Learn which of these works for you and use it. Many artists have found it useful to keep a notepad or tape recorder next to them as they drive. Steven Spielberg claims that his very best ideas have come to him as he was driving the freeways. This is no accident. And, oh man, if this is not true for me. Again, for me, it's the shower and driving, especially when I don't have something on. So while I was finishing my dissertation, and when I was in the most difficult spots where I just was stuck, because I work, and I've explained my creative process before as a writer, as I work as a mosaic. I'm a mosaic thinker. I see all sorts of pieces and stuff and how they come together to create a cohesive whole. But then the hard part is getting that cohesive whole described in a linear fashion, and that's really hard.
Yeah.
And so when I would get stuck during my dissertation, I would actually just go and I would sit in the shower. I would just turn the water on, and I would just sit in the shower for however long, and just sort of meditate, and just let the shower block off all other thinking. And I would sit in the shower and let the water run. And I know it's terrible for the environment, whatever. So shoot me. But I would let the water run, and I would have my iPhone, which has the voice recorder, right outside the shower door or right outside the tub. And I would just sit there, and all of a sudden it'd be like, oh, I'd have that jolt of inspiration, and I would pull the phone, and turn it on quickly, rub my hand off with a towel real quick, turn the phone recorder on, and then just dictate what I was thinking, what came to mind. And some of the most complicated, complex parts of my dissertation were written that way. And before actually I started doing the recorder, one of my earliest published articles, I was doing this with as well, and earlier in the dissertation, before I was using the voice recorder, my wife would laugh at me because I would go and sit in the shower or stand in the shower or whatever, and then she'd see me run naked through the house and feverishly begin typing on my computer. I'm like standing up naked at my computer, typing feverishly, trying to get down what had just come to me in the shower. And I get down as much as I could, and then if it was enough, then I'd go and towel off, and I'd come back and resume. Or if it wasn't, I'd get what I could down, and then back to the shower.
And meanwhile, she's saying, "Hey, I just wanted you to meet the new neighbors. They're right here."
Yeah, exactly. But I found that using the recorder was even better, because then dictating was the way to go. And I found that for a lot of my more complicated writing, I dictate first. I dictate to get the stuff on the page, and then I can edit, so that you don't deal with any of the perfectionism of the grammar's wrong as I'm typing this out. And the same thing in the car. I've always got my iPhone there, and I've got dozens and probably hundreds at this point of notes and voice memos of various things that either are currently a part of a project or a future project or whatever, that come to me while I'm driving. And it's the same thing. And the thing is, one of the best things you can do as a creative, and I think she's right about this, is figure out what works, and then make sure you have the tools ready to take advantage of that. So if it's showering, a friend of mine actually gave me a waterproof pen, like a pencil or whatever, a waterproof pencil that will write on the wall of the shower, because he actually will use that to do equations and stuff in the shower that come to him and all this stuff, or write down ideas. So you can write on the wall, and then later on you can erase it. So I've got one of the, you can do all sorts of these things that take advantage of how when your brain relaxes, you can suddenly benefit from that, and you don't want to lose the inspiration by saying, "Oh yeah, clearly I'll remember it." No, you won't. So yeah, I loved that little section about how to use that inspiration stuff.
Yeah. Well, you also had some critiques of the book, correct?
Yeah, a few. I mean, there are some that are just nitpicky. Some of them are nitpicky. I mean, you have, she just as a pet peeve of mine, she says, Christ said, wherever two or more are gathered together, there I am in your midst. And he didn't actually say that. The Gospels record where 2 or 3 are gathered together. Really, that's pedantic, but, don't at me. But one of the other issues that I had is that you have, particularly in one of the central chapters, you have this idea of where you're recovering a sense of abundance and possibility. Some of those sections where you have this idea that God's generosity is going to come in, and God will basically. You affirm where you want to go, and God's going to meet you there, and he's going to make it possible. So state what you want and get there. I'm cautious of that, partly because, in my view, if a theological conception of God and the universe doesn't apply so well to, say, an Indian Dalit or a woman in Afghanistan, then maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it's not quite framed well. So you could make the case. Just name your ultimate goal, and I visualized. You hear this with Tony Robbins and these people where, and Joel Osteen and some of these others, where you get this idea of just visualize and affirm that, that nice big house that you're going to have down the line, and eventually, God will bring it to pass. Well, is that same principle true of that woman in Afghanistan? It may, there may be some synchronicity that's possible, say, for someone who is living in the U.S. on some of this, but I'm really nervous about applying that lesson, or to say that that's how things work when, someone who's in an oppressed situation, that if you told them that, I'm sorry, it's just not going to work. That woman in Afghanistan can envision that nice house with a picket fence, but odds are it's not going to come. Mm-hmm. So on the flip side, I do think that this idea of viewing God as a God of abundance rather than a God who is miserly and doesn't want to give good things, I think that's an important lesson. I think that's true. And I think that learning to reshape our will to figure out why we've been put here and to do that is really important. And sometimes that involves serving, and more often than not, that involves finding a way to serve other people, so that, maybe that woman in Afghanistan does have a better life as a result of something that I did over here, chaos theory, right? But, I may be able to do something here that down the line in a generation is going to help someone on the other side of the world. But
this makes me think of the Bird by Bird, where she's talking about God may look at the foundation you have, or what you're wanting to envision or do, and say you're on the completely wrong path here. We need to get rid of all this and start over. And so I think that's another side of all this of what if you're envisioning or trying to speak the wrong thing into being. Almost that idea we were talking about earlier of your prayers being answered, or be careful what you ask for, you just might get it.
Yeah, sometimes we need to be, and that's where the listening part is, I think, more important than the affirmation part. And she spends more time on the affirmation part in some of these, particularly in some chapters, but there seems to be more attention on the affirmation part and really getting people to believe in themselves as, agents of God's creativity and so on, more so than the listen for purpose part. And sometimes that I'm just afraid that certain parts of this get turned from the necessary lesson of you need to love yourself and you need to recognize that God is a God of abundance and loves you and so on, to excusing selfishness. And there are certain parts of this where it's like, you can be creative and you can still serve others. Mm-hmm. You can be creative as a way of serving others. You can be, find a way to serve others in any way possible that's gonna make lives better and make lives matter in this world. Because ultimately, yeah, creativity's great, but making art that, just for the sake of art isn't necessarily it doesn't have meaning in itself. Art doesn't have meaning in and of itself inherently. We need to find things that actually do have meaning and find ways to be creative in ways that are going to have meaning. And some of that has to do with helping other people and serving other people and making other lives better, not just, finding a way for me to have a creative outlet that makes me feel good. So that was probably my biggest objection in the book is I think there could have been a little bit more emphasis on that. I don't think that she would oppose anything that I just said.
Yeah.
My reading of what she has in here is largely that she's aware of that and is conscious of that difference. And she does talk about the importance of having your vision transformed and listening to the creator to, get some sense of what it is that you should create and what your target should be and all that. So that's there. I just wish it could have been a little bit more accentuated, because there are some things in here that could be taken, I think, the wrong way on that other side. And that was my biggest complaint. And then the other pedantic thing is, she says marathon runners suggest you log 10 slow miles for every fast one. And that's definitely not true anymore, but
may have been in 92 when she wrote it.
That actually, it was true then, but research has shown otherwise now. And I actually think in terms of the advice of, spend a lot of time doing art that's bad or whatever, just slog through, I think is sometimes bad advice as well, because I tend to find that when you're at that point, it's time to step away and take your shower or whatever, and, take the time off so that your bursts are more productive. But
yeah,
at that point we're nitpicking a little bit, but I like the book a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's been really funny how this list of books so far, that there's been a lot of series of 2 books where it's very similar topics. So we've got Once an Eagle and we've got About Face. We've got this book, The Artist's Way, and we've got Bird by Bird. So it's kind of a neat way where we can compare them.
Yeah, which one did you like better between this one and Bird by Bird?
I would say this one.
Yeah, me too. Between the two, if I was going to recommend one to somebody, I would say this one. Yeah. There's a lot of good stuff in Bird by Bird too, but I would recommend this one above Bird by Bird, especially because it doesn't just apply to writing. Yeah,
and then the other benefit of it being more of a workbook type of book. Bird by Bird is more of you read through it and you could take some time to write some stuff out, but the Artist's Way actually encourages you to write stuff out as you're reading it. So yeah, of the two, I liked I connected more with this one. So yeah, that was kind of my main conclusion, that it was similar, but I like this one better. It was just a really helpful book in taking a step back and recovering what helps you to create art, and I've been doing the morning pages. I hope to get back into it a little more in the future again. And I'll just kind of close with this one quote that she has. I'm suggesting you take the term creator quite literally. You are seeking to forge a creative alliance, artist to artist, with a great creator. I just thought that was cool. It's stuff I've thought a lot about since 2008-ish in my life, around that time. And so I like that someone's written about it, and in this type of a format.
Yeah. I related with a lot of what this book had to say. I liked its view of creativity in general, its view of inspiration. One thing we didn't cover, and I'm actually going to close with a quote not from this book, but it talked a lot about how it talked in a few places about how all creativity and so on ultimately stems from the creator that flows through us, that we're actually just sort of riffing off of the creativity that's already out in the universe, that we're just shaping it.
Conduits.
Right. Yeah. We're conduits, and that there's nothing new. Right. One of the things I also liked is, the efforts to try to be original, that's toxic, because there is nothing original. All art is always just, riffing off of and working with what's already there. Mm-hmm. And so, you have that idea of inspiration, that you're shaping what's already been provided by the creator, and you're conduit for the creator. One of the things that I really appreciate about that is, again, that gets back to my understanding of creativity as well. And it's something that C.S. Lewis talked a lot about, and I've mentioned him a lot in this podcast, but I think there's a lot of similarities with what he says about inspiration in his book, Surprised by Joy, and art and the function of art and how all that works. But there's a song by Sixpence None the Richer that it's one of my favorite songs, and there's a particular verse of that song, which the song is about creativity and about doing what you're made to do. And I want to close actually with a quote from that, because it gets to this idea of what creativity really involves, about working with what's already with what you're tapping into, with what you're seeing in this realm of the creator, as it were, where it says, you're the scent of an unfound bloom, a simple tune I only write variations to. And I've always liked that particular idea, that there's this scent that we this is the concept of joy in C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy. There's this scent of a flower that is in our imagination that we can't quite touch, but it's what we long for. And yeah, there's this simple tune of the cosmos that I can only write variations to, but that's what I do. Right? So, and then it says, a key that will, to soothe the mood, a drink that will knock me down to the floor, a key that will unlock the door, where I hear a voice sing familiar themes, that beckons me, weaves notes in between, a tap and a string, a bow and a glass. You pour me till the day has passed. And then you have, this is my call, I belong to you. This is my call to sing the melodies of you. This is my call, I can do nothing else. I can do nothing else. I love that concept, because that is what it is to be a creative, to be someone who, and her argument in this book is that every human being is born to be a co-creator with God. Every human being is born to be creative, and to find what that call is, what little variations to the simple tune that's already been written, that we're all hearing a little bit of the strains of, what contribution can I make to that chorus, to that melody, because that's all I can do. I can do nothing else. I've always loved that song.
That's cool.
So I'll wrap with that one.
That's cool. Well, she does, in the reading list of the back of the book, she does have C.S. Lewis's Miracles in there.
It's fascinating that that's the book she would choose of his, because it's probably his worst book. But Surprised by Joy, actually, and we'll put a link to the information about that in the show notes. Surprised by Joy is the book that is really most about some of these artistic concepts, and there are a couple other places where that comes in. It's a pretty cool book.
Cool. Well, good. Well, that's going to do it for us today. Before we get out of here, just a reminder, you can follow us along at booksofTitans.com. Have a lot of resources there, and the reading list where we're at, reviews of each of the books. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at Books of Titans as well. Find us on the podcast solution service, whatever that you use. We'd love to get a review from you. Or just even ping us on one of the social platforms. Let us know how we're doing. You
can always write us a letter.
Yeah. Snail mail.
Or a postcard.
Oh, that'd be awesome. From wherever you live, that'd be really cool. We will be back soon to discuss the next book, which will be the autobiography of Malcolm X. On behalf of Jason Staples, I'm Eric Rosted, and this has been the Books of Titans podcast. Thanks for listening.
Keep listening, keep improving,
Keep it real.
and keep reading. Left that part out.